Nicholas, I guess we will use your slide deck,
Yep,
right?
I will move the slides.
Okay, makes sense. So we don't have to switch in the middle of it.
All right, perfect. So hello, everyone. This is the University College London Centre for Blockchain Technologies. This is the largest research centre for blockchain in the world, measured by number of associates. Welcome to a new episode of the online open seminar series. This is an initiative that was born in the face of the pandemic in 2020 as a way to give a voice to our community, to allow them to share their work and research findings. But since then, we've just kept on hosting these seminars because we received a very positive response to them. So today's session will last between 25 to 30 minutes, plus 5 to 10 minutes at the end for questions. Please use the Q&A function to ask your questions, and we will process them at the end of the presentation. So now, without any further ado, I wish to introduce Alexander Braun and Niklas Oisle. They will discuss collusion-proof decentralized autonomous organizations. Hello, guys. I will just leave you to introduce yourself and do your presentation.
So thank you very much, Mathilde, for the introduction. Thanks, everyone, for having us. We're really happy that we can present our most recent research paper on this seminar, and it's about decentralized autonomous organizations and the challenge to make those organizations both collusion-proof and incentive-compatible. So we decided that Nicholas will share the slides so that we don't have to switch back and forth, but we'll split the presentation in two parts. I'll do the first part, and Nicholas is going to continue with the second part. So I guess without further ado, let's start with the presentation. So Nicholas, if you could just move one step forward, that's great. So so what we are looking at is essentially that phenomenon that Vitalik Buterin in his Ethereum white paper already mentioned, the idea of a completely decentralized autonomous organization. And in the paper, we define it as an organization, a new organizational form that has a decentralized value creation process and also a decentralized decision-making process, which differentiates it from other forms of decentralized value creation where the decision-making is still centralized, such as, for example, virtual teams that are also used or have been used throughout the history. It's essentially in a public blockchain context, right? So workers or members of that organization can remain anonymous and they can join and leave without any permission. There's no hierarchy, there's no human management, and therefore there's also no way to actually use classical governance mechanisms. The whole thing is completely transparent because it runs on the blockchain and all the business rules are coded into the smart contracts on the blockchain. And then essentially, and this is where our paper also comes in, is decisions are made based on consensus of the network participants. So we are looking specifically at a case where not everything in the DAO can be fully automated. We're looking at a case where the operational processes to a large extent can be automated using smart contracts, but then for certain changes to operational procedures, but also for special cases that can come up in terms of governance, we still need human intervention and we need to have a consensus of the network participants. So on this slide, what we're showing is the general structure of the DAO as we're looking at it. So you have a set of workers, you can see them on the right-hand side, that come together and are orchestrated through the blockchain. There's no classical firm, if you want, no classical hierarchy that ties them together. They still able, due to the blockchain, to produce a service or a product, and the customer on the left-hand side can purchase that service or product in exchange for fiat currency or for a stable coin. And then on the right-hand side, in the top right-hand corner, we also have token holders, so-called governance token holders. They hold the native token of the DAO. And that token has several functions. First of all, it is a form of venture capital in an ICO. It can be used to raise funding to basically start DAO in the first place. And then it can be used for staking. So we will, in our model, look at it from the perspective of a collateral. So you can take this deposit or collateral to incentivize the workers. And the third function is essentially it carries voting rights. It can be used by token holders to actually decide to achieve certain consensus on decisions that may arise during the life of the DAO. If we look at the relevance of the topic, and then and you probably all know that, so I'm not telling anything new here. If you look at blockchain sources, then you see that the phenomenon has grown considerably in the last years. So there was the DAO case in 2016, but now we have over 1,000 DAOs. 65 of them show an asset base of more than $100 million and have more than 1,000 members. So this is starting to become a relevant organizational form. And with it, it's starting to become an interesting topic also for research. There are various different types of DAOs, developer collectives, DAOs that deliver decentralized finance services. There are also decentralized insurance platforms such as EtherRisk and so forth. So these things cover a wide array of services, if you want, of products in the virtual world, and are an interesting subject for research. Now, the motivation for the paper really came from the fact that we looked at the DAOs that are out there, and we looked also at the media coverage of DAOs, and it turns out that many of them had problems in the past, particularly problems with governance. So some of them were fraud cases, some just didn't work the way they should work, and even all the way to the famous Maker DAO, which also had problems in 2020 with governance. There's an article on CoinDesk about that. So that shows us that when these things have been designed, the operational procedures are usually really well thought out. So people with a relevant background in this area really think well how to code these smart contracts. But then when it comes to governance, it seems like it's all still in an experimental stage. The governance mechanisms, governance designs are still in their infancy and are sort of tested in a real life scenario. So that creates the motivation for the paper. We think that there is a need for new governance mechanisms because obviously you can't govern a DAO like you can govern a traditional organization. There's no managerial oversight, as I already mentioned. There are no hierarchies. So you need different mechanisms, and that's what the paper is focusing on. The contribution that we make is we basically create a microeconomic model. So we approach the problem from a normative perspective. That's important to mention. We are not trying to remodel any of the DAOs that are currently out there. We are getting at the problem with a blank paper from a normative perspective and try to provide a blueprint for a working governance for DAOs in the future. And that governance needs to solve two problems. It needs to solve the incentivization problem. So how do you ensure that the workers that are supposed to deliver the services and products of the DAO, how can you ensure that they exert effort? So they need to expend effort, and you need a mechanism to make sure that that happens. That's the incentivization. You can do that with staking. So you can basically take a collateral until the service is done, and then you can assess the outcome. And if the outcome is good, the collateral is returned, the stake is returned, and if not, you can confiscate it. That's an interesting thing. You can do that, but then that creates an additional problem, which is collusion. Right? And this is something we think has been overlooked to a certain extent until today, because taking a collateral means that the worker who should exert effort can still actually shirk, so not exert effort, and then try to bribe his way through afterwards when the collateral is up for a decision, when the DAO members need to decide whether the outcome was adequate or whether it was inadequate. And so this creates a problem for collusion in a DAO context where you have voting rights attached to the token of the DAO. This problem is even more prevalent because by staking, that person already has voting rights that allow him or her to actually vote in favor of an acquittal decision and avoid a conviction after a negative outcome. So how does collusion work? So one might think that it's not possible in a decentralized context. We think it is. There are a lot of examples. If you think about pump and dump schemes, people are actually using off-chain communication such as Telegram or other messengers to basically orchestrate their behavior. So the anonymity that one may think is there is in a sense can be overcome through such measures. There's wallet-to-wallet messaging, and in a sense, it's also in this context, it is feasible in the sense that you can code a bribing offer to others into a smart contract, which makes it trustless in a sense that others know that it will be executed. So they can rely on that bribing offer, and you can announce the bribing offers to other DAO members through those messaging or communication channels. And then they can decide whether they want to vote in favor of a conviction or vote against a conviction. So for shirkers, for people who didn't exert effort, there is a way to actually get away with that if there is no proper governance in place. In terms of the literature, I think I want to be short here, not to waste too much time. We contribute to several strands of an emerging literature on financial economics, if you want, of decentralized organizations, tokenomics or token economics, and also the wider blockchain literature on consensus and so forth. Here is the Nash game, of the game that we're looking at in our model, in our normative model. As I said, the worker who wants to participate in the DAO, it has to stake, has to provide the collateral, and then afterwards he or she can decide whether to exert effort or not. So not exerting effort is what, from an economics perspective, you would call shirking. So if the person decides not to shirk, then in our model, the revenue is generated, the DAO revenue is generated with certainty, and the game is over. If this person decides to shirk, then there is a probability that revenue will not be generated because the effort is missing, the effort has not been exerted. So in this case, if revenue is not generated, then the DAO needs to make a decision to convict or acquit. And before that decision is made, the individual that is being basically accused of the shirking can decide to bribe or not to bribe others. If that person decides not to bribe, that person will be convicted. If the person decides to bribe, then depending on the bribing strategy that the person applies, there can be a conviction or an acquittal outcome. And we are interested in equilibria in which basically effort is exerted by all of the participants in the DAO. So on this slide, what we see is that the central formal economic problem that we have in this case. So essentially, we think about it from the planner, the perspective of the planner of a DAO. So when you first think about how to design your governance, then you have several variables at your disposal. So two that we're looking at here is the vector Z or Z and the vector S. Z is essentially how you distribute the revenue among the participants. S is the staking scheme. So which stakes, what is the size of the stakes that you demand from each of the participants that want to join in creating that product or service. And the goal is to maximize the surplus of the DAO, which is the difference between its revenue R that you can see in the top line here, minus the sum of all the efforts exerted by the members of the DAO, and also minus the costs for the stake. So R is just some rate of return. It could be a cost of capital because the stake is a monetary magnitude. So essentially, people will have some cost of capital on the collateral because they're not able to access that. So you want to maximize that, but there's several side conditions or restrictions you need to take into account. The first one is the incentivization or incentive constraint. So essentially what you want is that it is better the outcome for the person is better if they don't shirk compared to if they shirk. So on the left-hand side, you have the share of the revenue that the person will get minus the effort. That is the case if they don't shirk. And on the right-hand side, you have an expected value of the revenue that you get if you shirk, because the probability for success will be lower, will be P0, minus the expected cost that you have, because you will be losing the stake in case you get convicted. So essentially, this says it needs to be better for that DAO to be incentive compatible. It needs to be better for everyone to exert effort than not to exert effort. The next constraint is the participation constraint. It's essentially very simple. It says that for anyone to join this DAO and work in it, they need to expect a positive outcome for themselves, right? So more than 0. So the revenue minus the effort minus the staking costs needs to be positive. Otherwise, people would not, rational economic agents would not join the DAO in the first place. Then we have the resource constraint. Pretty simple too. You cannot distribute more than the total revenue among the participants. So no matter how you choose Z, you cannot distribute more than 100% of the revenue, right? And the last one is the interesting thing. This is what we call the bribing constraint, and that's particularly relevant in this case here with DAOs. So essentially, what we have is on the left-hand side, we have the stake that the person I or individual I put up as a collateral. On the right-hand side, we have the outcome in terms of bribing. So the expected bribing costs, that's the first summoned, summed up across all states, all possible bribing states. Then we have on the right-hand side also the second summoned, that is the expected loss of the stake in case the person is convicted despite the fact that it attempted to bribe others, right? So the bribing strategy can fail. If your bribing strategy fails, the DAO will still confiscate your stake. You will lose it. So this is the expected cost of that. And then the third summoned is a very interesting one. Those are the costs of contacting others for the bribing, right? So as we said before, it is possible to contact others, but it is not completely costless. And the larger the DAO in terms of members, the more difficult it will be. So M is the number of people you contact for bribing. The larger that M will be, the higher the costs. So that means that implicitly, if you have a very large DAO with a lot of members, it gets more difficult to achieve a majority for an acquittal decision. And at this point, maybe we can switch over to Nicholas and start with the second part of the presentation.
That's perfect. So I'll talk about the different cases we have now when we can achieve collusion proofness and when we can't achieve collusion proofness. And you can see here a summary graph, basically what happens. On the x-axis, you see M, so how many people need to be contacted for bribing as a malfeasant worker. And on the y-axis, you see the revenue. The higher the revenue, the easier it is usually to make the system collusion proof, because the more money we have to give away to people. You can see this in area D. When revenue is sufficiently large enough, the system becomes collusion proofness. Because I mean, if you have like $1 million to give away conditional on an outcome, you can write contracts, which makes it pretty easy. So everybody exerts effort, basically. So not a problem here. We also have this area C, basically, where the DAO is so large enough that it's not that it's too expensive to bribe basically others, and it becomes not feasible anymore to collude in that DAO. So these two are pretty safe and pretty great. Then we have these red areas where it's not possible to make incentive compatible and collusion-proof DAO. So when the revenue generated is less than the effort one has to expend, for example, when you only get $1 or there's only $1 generated, but you have to put in tens of thousands of dollars of work, this DAO will not be feasible in the long run. So nothing we can do here. and also in B, which is similar to A, but with some agency cost added to it. What's really interesting and what's our main paper focused on is area D, which is basically most DAOs. They don't generate enough of revenue to be here in this comfort area where it's pretty easy to do. And they're also not large enough that it becomes infeasible to collude with others. And for these systems, we look at the cases when we can and how we can, with smart governance choices, how we can make the system collusion proof. And the first thing we do is we look at the optimal revenue and optimal stake. Basically, the revenue is optimal proportional to the effort exerted, and we can also derive formula for the stake. So let's jump to something interesting, to the first area, basically. When we look at this graph here, area C. When is a DAO large enough that it becomes infeasible for collusion, basically? And we can derive a sufficient condition for collusion proofness. You can see it here. And the stake has to be smaller than the cost, C, basically, of this inner sum. And this inner sum is depending on the network participant N and the market constant, or on the concentration of the participant. This is denoted by HV, which is the Herfindahl index, and is commonly used to measure market concentration. And the lower the concentration this index is, basically, the more decentralized a DAO is, and the higher the cost it is to contact others, to write specific smart contracts, for example, and so on. So in these cases, the stake one might lose if he shirks, basically, and wants to bribe others. It's more expensive to do that just by the frictions created by contacting too many people instead of just having paying the stake, basically. The problem is we can't rely on that because that's exogenous, right? If the DAO is big, great for you, great news. But I mean, the DAO starts usually very small, and to start growing, it needs to be incentive and collusion proof through all, basically through all the stages of the DAO, basically. So maybe we can influence this with the voting system. And we look at three popular ones. We look at majority voting, which is just like normal elections. No, it's not like where we need a 50% majority, basically. So 50%, 51% vote for conviction. The Malfeasance gets convicted. And individual votes are visible. So classic on-chain voting on the blockchain, you can see exactly who voted for whom, and outcomes and individual voting outcomes are visible. This is different from masked voting, where we still need a 50% majority, but we don't see the individual votes. We just see the total voting decision and the number of votes. So this is more close to classic government elections, like politicians' elections, where we don't see how individuals voted, but we see the outcome, basically. And lastly, this is really interesting, and one of our main contributions to the paper, to the literature, is stochastic voting. You can think of it like as a random ballot vote. Everybody writes on a piece of paper his voting preference, like yes or no, conviction or acquittal. It gets all put in a big ballot, basically, and then some person draws one paper out of it and looks what is written on it, and this is basically the decisive vote. And the probability that this vote is drawn is that one's vote is drawn is proportional to the stake size. So this is pretty, has similarities to proof of stake, basically, how the next writer on for the block is elected, basically. And to evaluate the bribing strategies, basically, or to evaluate how good the different voting systems perform, we look at efficient bribing strategies. And we try to minimize, basically, the bribing cost, which is the first part here, conditional on we can condition this bribing vector on specific outcomes. So for example, we can condition it on 2 people voted for conviction, 6 people voted for acquittal, for example. And we can write contingent contracts, smart contracts, contingent on specific outcomes, because it's all on the blockchain, visible and transparent to everybody. And we also have the second part here. In case one gets convicted, conditional on a bribing vector, we obviously have to pay the stake. So it might be beneficial to reduce the bribing cost, but in some cases be convicted if it's still a positive move in total. And let me tell you a very efficient bribing strategy, which is the pivotal voting strategy, which is usually a culprit which makes a lot of systems not collusion proof anymore. And how it works is, if one person is a decisive voter, you will get compensated very well, basically. So you get compensated for all the cost it is taken care of and a little bit more. But in case you're not this is a decisive vote, you just get a penny. So if you think about it, if 80% vote for conviction and 20% vote for acquittal, and you have to decide what you're voting for, then you realize, because 80% voted for conviction, he will get acquitted anyways, the malfeasant worker. So I just vote for acquittal and get at least some money in addition, basically, which might be $1 or a small sum, basically, for myself, because my vote doesn't matter. And also in the other direction, when 80% or 90% vote for acquittal and only 10% vote for conviction, he will get acquitted, basically. So for me, it's just, or for a normal voter, it's then just smart to vote for acquittal, take the bribe, and get a small amount of money because he can't change the outcome anyways. So in all these cases, basically, if the person gets convicted, if the person gets acquitted without my vote in any case, and in the case where I'm the decisive voter and I can influence the election, basically, then I get compensated very well. So in each of these scenarios, I get more money by voting for acquittal and accept the bribe than voting like I would normally, without having the offer of the bribe. And with this strategy, we find that it's strictly dominant to accept the bribe and vote for acquittal. And it's really bad that this is the case, because then the malfeasant worker can be nearly costlessly acquitted, basically. Because if everybody votes for acquittal and accepts the bribe, we will end up in this scenario here, where a lot of people vote for acquittal, there is not the decisive voting outcome, and everybody just gets pennies. But malfeasant worker gets acquitted, he walks away free by shirking, which is obviously for the DAO very bad. So with classic majority voting, we cannot prevent collusion. With mask voting, it's a little bit more difficult. We can only condition on aggregate outcomes, and in most cases, we have collusion proofness. So not a problem, everything is well. But a lot of, we don't see it in reality, and for good reasons, because I mean, the whole point of the blockchain and is transparency, and with mask voting, we give this basically up. But we might have a third solution, which is stochastic voting. And stochastic voting has a key property. It keeps the pivot probability fixed, basically. So it's just one stake as a ratio compared to all the other stake. Here in this scenario here with the majority voting bribing strategy, the probability of being pivotal depends on all the other people too. So, and in this case here, this is not the case, it's fixed. But still, with stochastic voting itself, the probability is still too small to be the decisive voter, and bribing is still too cheap, and stochastic voting itself does not prevent collusion. But token holders can come to the rescue, basically. With token holders who are not participating in the value creation process, but participate like in voting decisions and have like maybe a lot of tokens basically, this might change. With majority voting, there is nothing different here. It does not prevent collusion. But if the concentration of the voting power of the token holders is sufficiently enough, in combination with stochastic voting, we can prevent collusion. We can make the system collusion-proof, and as a designer of a DAO, we can make this decision basically. We can influence it with our design compared to, for example, the size or other properties like the revenue. And the reason why this is happening, there are three factors. It is the fixed probability of being pivotal. This is really important because your vote or the probability of being elected to being the decisive vote does not depend on the other people and their voting behavior. We also find that the pivot probability is much larger for bigger token holders because if you have like a lot of tokens, you are much more likely to be drawn from the pool of votes basically. And in addition, you have also much more to lose because in addition to being to have a higher pivot probability, you also lose much more if you vote wrongly, if you don't punish the malfeasant worker. And all of these three combined lead basically to a case where the bribe which we would have to pay to these large whales, these large token whales, would be too expensive, and this makes the system basically collusion-proof. So to conclude, what we did in our paper, we developed a normative blueprint to solve both the incentive compatibility issue and the collusion-proofness, and we find collusion can be prevented in multiple ways with high enough revenue, large size, and sufficiently decentralization, mask voting. But all these are not ideal because we can't influence it or because it goes against the spirit of DAO and blockchain. So what's really nice is that we have another choice, which is stochastic voting strategies, and we have a few centralized token holders, and this is sufficient for the collusion proofness in the DAO. So I thank you all for your attention and hope you like it. And now we are eager to hear about your questions, which I see already in the chat here.
Thank you very much, Alexander and Niklas, for this wonderful presentation that highlights the importance of governance rather than just developing perfect smart contracts where we cannot, embed all the scenarios that we can instead observe as humans. So thank you very much. And let's move on to the questions that we have. So Bipin Bharathan, I hope I'm pronouncing your name and surnames right. What if the friction for contacting participants goes down due to the participation in social networks associated with the DAO?
Mm-hmm. So maybe I can say something about this. So if the individual friction goes down, then it will still be helpful if the DAO is very large and decentralized, right? So the important thing is, and I think we might have gone over that a little too quickly every now and then, is it's two things, right? It's not only large, it also needs to be decentralized. So if there's only a large number of members, but 2 or 3 are so influential in terms of their stake sizes that they can easily come together to get the 51% majority vote, then there is a high concentration of voting power, and then the frictions are very low because you only have to contact 2 people and they will be able to do that. But if you have a sufficiently large decentralization, so low concentration of the voting power up to the point where everyone holds the same sort of voting power as everyone else, so completely homogeneous case, and there are a lot of members, then even if the friction goes down, since you have to contact so many members to essentially get that 51% vote, then it's still collusion proof, right? So if you let the number of members N of the DAO go to infinity, then the number of members M that you have to contact in a case where the voting power is completely evenly distributed is still very, very large. Does that make sense for you? Hope that answers the question.
Is asked a new one in the meantime. So how realistic is that? what do real DAOs reveal in times of decentralization?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. So it ties in with your previous question. I'm just reading the chat. So only plutocracy is workable. So what we're essentially finding in the paper is that, yes, if the DAO is not very
Maybe
well.
I can answer that one.
Oh yeah, go for it. Sorry,
Yeah,
Nicholas.
for
Jump in. Yeah.
It's really interesting because it might be a little bit too harsh because it does not mean everybody has to be wealthy or it's governed by the wealthy. What it just means, we need like some people who have like enough commitment because they have enough to lose basically in the system for the system to work basically. And we actually see this also in other cases in reality. Think, for example, of like stock companies or like in the S&P 500, what we usually see, we have like a lot of stocks distributed among shareholders, and you will always find, or most in cases, a few shareholders who have like a larger share, like 10 or 15%, because they are actually putting pressure on management, so it's properly governed. So it does not mean we only need like wealthy government and voters basically, but we need at least some who have enough stake, to have enough incentive basically to make it proper and be resilient against any bribing attacks basically.
Mm-hmm.
Hope that helps.
Yeah, and how realistic is it? So we think it really matches what we see in reality right now, because we see a lot of DAOs that are not sufficiently, in terms of voting power, are not sufficiently decentralized. Voting power is rather concentrated, and the DAOs, I mentioned that on one of the first slides. There are 65 with more than 1,000 members, but there are also a lot of DAOs with a lot less than 1,000 members. So essentially, you are in that situation that in real life, a lot of DAOs have a concentration of voting power and a lower number of members. And then what Nicholas just mentioned is the solution is you have these larger token holders with larger voting power as the guardians, right? So they have a lot to lose, and their incentives are usually not to sacrifice their own wealth or in terms of their token value by acquitting someone that has obviously shirked or has obviously done something that is not to the benefit of the DAO. So essentially, that is the trick, right? So to take these people, these whales or this token holders with a lot of voting power, to make them to ensure that collusion is not happening.
And maybe I can jump in with the next one with quadratic voting, which is an excellent point. And we didn't have included in the paper, but maybe we should write a section about it. But it's also not collusion proof. Like we can show it that it's not. It still doesn't work because the bribing is still cheap enough with this bribing strategy, basically with this pivotal strategy, basically, that it's still possible to bribe very cheaply. Would be great, but unfortunately doesn't work.
And then I can just see Java has actually a two-part question. So the first part, do you factor in future expected benefits of holding a large quantity of tokens? So what we do have is in the decision-making process of the individuals in our model, essentially what they anticipate is if they acquit a person that is obviously guilty, then this will have a detrimental effect on the trust in the DAO, and the DAO token value will decrease. So I think we sort of skipped over that a little bit during the presentation, but there's this variable D, which reflects an unknown loss in token value that will materialize if the DAO fails in terms of governance. So if the DAO acquits obviously guilty workers, then that will have the effect of a loss in token value for all others. And that is an important point. It's also an important aspect in the model because that is anticipated by everyone in their decision-making process. And I think there's a second part of the question, which I have to read. It's a little longer. So the malicious player might be more incentivized to hoard a lot of DAO tokens to get the benefit of not only having a higher voting power at the moment, but also in the future entitled for higher income generated from the protocol. So I'm not sure if I'm getting the question right, but if I'm understanding it correctly, what you're thinking is that the malicious player could actually acquire more tokens to be able to vote himself out of the problem, right? So what if the malicious token holder acquires a large chunk of the tokens and therefore has a lot of voting power, and then they can shirk and they can just acquit themselves? But that will lead to a loss of value of their token holdings, right? So
yeah, so that's actually more expensive. So it's much cheaper to just bribe other people instead of because I mean, if you have more tokens, if you think about it, you basically have more skin in the game, basically, which as a malfeasant blocker you don't want to. You want to have the least amount of skin in the game because you actually just want to get all the means without having to bear all of the consequences from your actions, basically.
So maybe to just have a comparison, the economics behind that is essentially similar to the proof of stake consensus system, because there, you have to acquire a lot of tokens to have a large stake to be able to, then decide on the next block. And if you abuse that power, then that will undermine trust in the whole blockchain system that you're in, and all of the tokens that you have acquired to do that will suddenly lose a lot of value. So you're essentially cutting off the branch on which you are sitting, right? So you're basically hurting yourself, which is why, from an economic standpoint, proof of stake should work, and so should this in this case here. Really good questions. Thanks, that answers it. Cool. Yeah. All right.
Okay. So we'll see if we'll receive any more questions, but I want to thank you for tackling these questions. Oh, there's a new one.
There's a new one. This behavioral economics. Obviously, in our model, we looked at a very rational economic framework, because in the end is at least what we see, I think, maybe we can find data to back it up, is that a lot of people in that space act rationally. Like, if you make profit by doing it, people will do it. Behavioral aspect is still really important, because obviously we see in reality some DAOs which work really well, which don't have stochastic voting, for example. And what happens there is basically we have like founders, or like a team of founders, which have like a large share of tokens, basically, which do it for altruistic motives, or because they really like the DAO and they don't act selfishly, basically. So they have the bigger picture in mind. And this would work in mind, but this does not mean it's collusion proof. This is just because the founders specifically decided they wanted to do that. But you don't want a system which relies on the goodwill of a few people who founded the DAO. That's like, I don't think that's like a good strategy, to be honest.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, so the question is really good, because obviously we do not account for systematic deviations from rational behavior. So we wanted to look at it from a rational normative perspective first. But you're right. I mean, if there are certain behavioral elements that could play a role in the blockchain space, then they would warrant a further analysis from a behavioral economic standpoint. So just as one example, if someone is on a mission, let's say based on ideology or on a terrorist motive, they don't care about a loss in token value, right? That's, they would actually be prepared to pay money to hurt others, right? So this is something that our model does not account for. So if you have malicious actors in the system that are prepared to lose a certain amount of their own wealth, or to incur expenses just to undermine the system, that's a different story, right? And I think that needs to be looked at in future research, and it's very important. What we think our work is going to do is lay a first, is building a first foundation on which then further papers can build, and also take into account behavioral economics aspects.
Yeah, it's not because it's not mathematically tractable. I mean, we can do prospect theory, we can include like bias from Kahneman, Tversky, from the whole behavioral literature, basically. Obviously, you can do that, but I mean, it becomes quickly, we try to focus on the main aspect and on the main intuition and so on. If you want, like, we can look at this case and include it, like, this extension can be made. It's just, we focused on the main drivers and aspect, basically. So that's basically why we didn't look at behavioral extensions.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, to be honest, I think it would basically also be beyond the focus of this paper, but it's a really interesting question for a subsequent, for future papers that could look at that also from a, from a microeconomic perspective, but incorporating behavioral elements in the model now, which we haven't done yet. There's also a question from another attendee. What is the other research your team is involved in Web3, and how do we reach out to those pieces of research? So essentially, this is our, this is our first piece on blockchain and Web3, but hopefully there will be more in the future.
I'm writing my job market paper in June, so fingers crossed, maybe in December or something. We have some more, which we will hopefully also a paper. It goes also about voting or something, and excited to that. And we also have like some more practical applications, which is not like from a pure academic standpoint, but we collaborated with EtherRisk for some time for decentralized insurance applications. So we might be interested in that. That's not like really as rigorous as our theoretical paper, but it might be interesting how in practice one might have systems like this, which create value in a decentralized manner.
Yeah, and since we're here at the Institute of Insurance Economics of our university, the chances are that in future research we'll focus a little bit more on the DeFi and particularly the decentralized insurance space. So there's a lot of research on DeFi already, but not so much on decentralized insurance. So if anyone is interested in that, or maybe in a collaboration, then feel free to reach out. That goes with regard to future research as well. I think the best way to get to those pieces is send us an email, or we will keep you updated. So we have the contact now, so maybe we'll contact you through Java, or and hopefully get future papers on the working paper series as well.
Yeah, that would be awesome. Yeah.
And thanks everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you. You guys have been very kind in answering all these questions. So thank you very much. Before saying goodbye, I just want to share a news with all of you guys. So I will share my screen for a second. All right, so the University College London Centre for Blockchain Technologies is hosting the P2P Financial System Workshop. So this is an international workshop that covers an array of topics on P2P financial systems. And what it does is it brings together, it gathers academics, industry practitioners, regulators, policymakers, in order for them to discuss, share their experiences, points of view, perspectives, work, research findings, anything. The goal is to bridge the gap between evidence from the industry and academic research. Because of course the goal would be not just to develop an innovative financial landscape, but an integrated one. So this conference was launched in 2015 by our executive director, Paolo Tasca, and throughout the years it's been hosted in very important locations such as the Deutsche Bundesbank, the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland, the European Central Bank, and the University College London, where it's going back this year. So we will be hosting the P2P Financial Systems Conference on December 1st and 2nd. And this year focus will be placed on decentralized emerging digital technologies and their impact on alternative monetary instruments, environmental, social governance, investing, and financial stability. So 2 things that you should note is that the call for paper is open. So you can submit your paper until the end of September, and by the end of October, you will receive a notice of either acceptance or rejection. And finally, the early bird tickets are on sale. So this is a good occasion to get yours at a discounted price. And also, I would highly encourage you to check out the newly launched website. It's full of information, so anything you wish to know, you will definitely find it there. So this is it for today. I really hope you guys enjoyed today's presentation, and I hope to see you at our next seminar that will take place on September 15th. It will actually be hybrid, so we will host it at UCL, University College London, but also online. So there's no excuses to miss it. I hope you enjoy it, and see you soon. Bye, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Bye.